And I'm talking to everybody, is that right? Right now? Okay. I wasn't sure. Welcome, everyone. I am so honored and excited to welcome you to the 5th Annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Symposium. My name is Meredith Gray, and I am the Medical Director for our Gender Diversity Program here at KU. And in this year's program, we are focusing on gender diversity. Our goal is to take a deeper dive into an aspect of our culture that we may not be familiar or comfortable with. And today our goal is to better understand the transgender and gender nonconforming experience. Our hope is that each one of us will leave more educated, more empathetic, and more compassionate. Perhaps even more empowered to be advocates and allies against discrimination. Today we'll explore various perspectives on gender diversity, both local and global perspectives on intersex and trans issues. With our keynote speaker, we're also going to explore how our views of gender are in a Western construct. I'm incredibly proud to share the programming we have today. The list of speakers we have is truly world-class programming. So much so that members of our programming committee sent this agenda to the leaders of the Human Rights Campaign. I personally sent the symposium agenda to the chairs of the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, really to show off what we are doing here in Kansas and how world-class this symposium is. First, I would like to thank all of our speakers. I want to share with everyone here today that I think every single person that we contacted, we cold called and cold emailed them, agreed to speak. They modified their busy schedules, they made accommodations, they all were excited to come and educate us so that we can provide better care and be better neighbors. These speakers honestly devote their time to making the world a better place. I also want to make a special thank you to a few members of our programming committee. Ms. Antoinette Redman, she is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager at the University of Kansas. Kimberly Connolly, the co-chair of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Programming Committee. For Ms. Connolly, I sent her a list of dream speakers we wanted to have today, basically just their names and where I heard about them. And Ms. Redman and Connolly and other members of the program committee did a lot of sleuthing, went on Facebook, Googled to find these incredible speakers we have today. A tremendous amount of work was put into getting this world-class programming. And of course, Geraldine McGee, who is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and every single member of our programming committee. So with that, I welcome you to begin this day of learning with our first speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tori Gleason. I'm located in Goodland, Kansas. So we're out here in mountain time in the middle of nowhere. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from here. And so I'm honored to be here today. I want to thank the DEI committee. I want to thank Dr. McGee and their team, Dr. Gray, everyone that's been involved in this process. And I'm just so excited to be here. 5 years ago, and this is the Trans Day of Visibility, which we all know, and this was purposefully planned. 5 years ago, I didn't think I'd have the courage and strength to be myself. 5 years later, here I am presenting at a trans conference, being myself, showing up, being authentic in Western Kansas of all places. We've got 3 stoplights and we only need 1. And so this is why we're here. This is why we do what we do. This is why the amazing clinicians, physicians, and team members that love with empathy, love with kindness, love with compassion show up every day to make sure that people are seen, people are taken care of, people are affirmed and included for who they are. Today, I'm not going to let 8 o'clock in the morning is way too early for death by PowerPoint. So we're not having that today. So it's like baking a pie with your grandma Gigi. Like there's no recipe, but we're going to get there. And if all you learned how to do is bake a pie, you weren't really paying attention because I'm going to teach you a lot more than just baking a pie. And so I guess what I want to talk to you today is just about The Trans Health 101, talk about broad. Thanks for the latitude in that. I need a lot of latitude because I'm extra. And so that's needed and definitely warranted. And so, this goes beyond, just definitions and umbrella terms. It goes beyond just like who you are. I think yesterday the seminar that Dr. Gray and Dr. Acosta-Linz, everyone put together was amazing. One of the things Dr. Tara Acosta-Linz says, honor the way the patient mirrors themselves or talks about themselves. Mirror that language. Ask them. Don't try and put them in your little trans box of what you've learned in your 3 seminars or your 100 seminars. Like, learn from them, mirror that language, talk to them. And so that's the big thing in the state of Kansas. If you look at the Williams Institute, we have 9,300 estimated, if you will, adult trans patients and non-binary patients. We have 1,300 trans youth aged 13 to 17. There's a lot of us. Even though we're not as visible as we'd like to be, take a look at the current legislation and you'd understand why. If you look at the gender minority stress model, it's pretty easy to understand the complexities of why we have so many health struggles. It's pretty easy to understand why it's so difficult at times just to get a job, to make sure you navigate having a home, to make sure you navigate adoption, to make sure you navigate just living, the common things like going to the restroom, things like that you don't think about. Like, okay, I'm going to be in a public place. Have I drank too much water? Am I going to drink before 10, after 10? I want to make sure. Like my friends jokingly say, 2PC me, because I have to go to the buddy system to use the restroom, because in some counties I can actually be ticketed for that. And so just the common thing of going to a basketball game at the local, field house brings on anxiety that most people don't think about. You pee and wash your hands. That's it. It's really that simple. For us, it's not. We have to think about, is this the bathroom I get put up against the wall? Is this the bathroom I get arrested in? Is this the bathroom I get accosted in? So there's so many complexities to this. And again, not all bad. Again, there's so much to be proud of, so much progress. When I see my friends that I get to present with today, I'm so proud of Professor Paisley and so many others that are doing the work of learning and unlearning that we have to do, that we discuss those microaggressions and macroaggressions that we face on a daily, with anyone in a minority model. And so having those conversations, I think, is imperative. Having those, willing to lean in and just have those conversations. I jokingly say that, I'm not the only one transitioning in my rural Western Kansas community. My entire community is transitioning with me. I'm the first trans person they met in a town of 3,700 people in a county of 6,000 people. So sometimes I get to be asked Google. Some people, and I keep in mind, my N equals 1, I am one trans person. I do not represent the entire trans experience. I represent my social and medical transition. That's it. But I let myself, I'll give you my cell phone number. I'll give you my email. If you want to talk, let's talk. And I think that that's how we learn, and that's how we move together. That's how we progress. That's how we learn to have empathy for people that just fit outside. I like to joke that I'm a statistical outlier, and I kind of take that with pride at days. I don't want to fit in a box. Sometimes it feels like politicians would rather have us put in a different box. And so we try and do our best. When we talk about gendered terms such as, transgender, cisgender, let's get on the same page. I know this is elementary. It's as simple as this, but I'm going to start this off with, take a pen in your hand and put it in your dominant hand that you write with. Feels comfortable, right? That's how you are. You're right-handed. Now put it in your left and write with that. That's what it's like to be trans. It doesn't feel right. It just does not feel right. Even though the whole country says, you were born, we saw your right hand first, you're right-handed, but I'm a left-handed person. It just feels normal. It feels natural. That's who I am. And so we try and switch the pen to the other side. We try and make sure that people understand that it's just different. It's just something that, like, my pen naturally fits in the right hand, not the left, even though the world tells me I'm a left-handed person. And so that's what it's like, because when you were born, if you're cis, the doctor slapped you on the butt, and said, girl, and then you close your eyes and you're like, girl, welcome to being a cis female. If the doctor slapped you on the butt and said male, and you close your eyes and you're like, male, welcome to be a cis male. Same thing is, When I was born, the doctor slapped me on the butt and said male. But when I closed my eyes, and for as long as I can remember, my earliest memory, 5, 6, girl, that's trans. I'm not congruent with the way that basically I was put on my birth certificate. I think I take pride in just being different. But it's a struggle, I'm not gonna lie. And so whether you're on this spectrum of, trans feminine, trans male, or whether you're gender queer, whether you're, non-binary, whether you're third gender, agender, bigender, demi girl, demi boy, I'm on the alphabet mafia side of TikTok. And so that's where I hang out. And so it just understanding that language changes. Language is always evolving. And so with your patient population, with that, make sure that you're asking questions and tell me more about that. Dr. Acosta Lynn said more about that yesterday. Tell me more. Instead of, check this box because we have rigid standards in our EHR or on our paper forms. Tell me more about you and your inclusive language. And then affirm them for who they are. Use their vocabulary. This is where she said mirror them. So it's hard because microaggressions are real. Like, close your eyes for a second and listen to me talk. Do you envision a female? Do you hear a male? What about now? Because this is where my normal voice is. What vision do you have now? Who do you see? Do you treat me differently as a clinician? Because my voice changes. What about if I'm up here? What about if I'm up here or down here? It doesn't really matter. So I change my voice. I code switch based on my safety. I code switch based on, and you guys can open your eyes now. I know it's too early to keep your eyes closed that long. Y'all are going to be out. I just know it. And so I code switch based on where I'm at. If I'm safe, I deal with an agricultural population out here. Listen, this person does not earn a living very well. This person does a lot better. And so making sure that we're having those conversations about, and people in the minority know what code switching is. You do it for safety. You do it because, I know I have to change who I am based on the people I'm around. Can I be safe? Are people going to affirm who I am? Am I going to be arrested? Am I going to be physically hurt? I travel in packs for safety. It's just the way it is. My voice and the way I talk changes based on who I'm with, just because I know that that's the way I have to navigate society. It's different. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I cannot thank the work that Dr. McGee and the rest of her committee is doing. I watched a quarterly meeting and I watched her navigate 100 people through an hour meeting. I've been on a hospital board here for 10 years. We can't get 15 people through a 3-hour meeting, let alone get 80 people through, or 80 to 100 people through an hour meeting. So I am, just in awe of the skill set of her team. So we talk about what it is to just be different. That's the health experience, right? The gender minority stress model, which we commonly talk about, is that gender-based rejection. I get rejected every day. Some of my most stressful times, pull up to Starbucks. That's always fun. I get sirred every time I'm there. Doesn't matter if I talk up here, and it doesn't matter if I talk down here. So either way, I get misgendered. I get it's gender euphoria, which is amazing because that's when someone actually affirms who I am, and that does not happen very often. I'm not going to lie, especially in Western Kansas. I think that it's hard, that identity non-affirmation. I've seen that in the clinic. There's nothing worse as a trans person than walking into a healthcare facility. When 23 to 33% of trans people will not walk into a clinic because of fear of rejection, because of mistreatment, there's a problem. So when we look at those social determinants of health, when we look at a health equity standpoint, when we look at just basic prevention, you're going to miss things if you don't have an inclusive and an affirming environment. You're not going to catch the things you need to. What about cancer screens? I'm blessed to serve in the Masonic Cancer Alliance Community Advisory Board, and the amazingly brilliant people, Ashley Spalding, who also happens to be on your DEI committee, and Hope, and so many others. We're going to miss those people if we don't have an inclusive space. What about the clinics in Western Kansas? Colby, Goodland. What about Dodge, Garden? If they don't feel like they're welcome for a cancer screen, how can we have early intervention? How can we have prevention? How can we have screening? How can we actually engage with them at such an early, early aspect of the disease process. So luckily, we've been given the green light, along with a couple others, Brooke Groman and another great friend of mine, Gabby Flores from Children's Mercy. We're going to be doing the DEI work for all of our hospital facilities around the state, our clinic facilities with the Masonic Cancer Alliance, to actually do the DEI education to make sure they know they have to create an inclusive space. You have to make sure that all are welcome here. And so it comes without saying, there's work to do. We have a lot of learning to do and a heck of a lot of unlearning to do. And so let's make sure we're engaging that conversation. We know that basically, my intersectionality as a trans woman and then as a Christian woman of faith, and that in the middle gets to be, we're all complex, every one of us. And so we are working hard to make sure that we know that we are more than, I'm more than just my trans identity. I'm more than my bisexual identity. I'm queer AF. I just want you all to know that's who I am. And so I am so much more, as are all of you. And so, but the trans broken arm syndrome, when I walk into a clinic or hospital, it's real. Nothing more than, long story short, but I stabbed myself putting my hand in the dishwasher, not because I was trans, which you would think it was true based on the ER visit, but because the person I was with at the time liked to load sharps up, not sharps down. But to ask about my hormone protocol, I'm like, I'm just bleeding. I need some sutures. That's all I need. But I'm going through like, tell me about your progesterone and your estradiol. I'd already given a med list, but here I am. I'm just bleeding. And so, and I'm just answering questions. I'm like, well, I really don't have any idea how this has anything to do. I'm on the board. My picture's in the goddamn hallway. It's hard to miss me. I stick out like a purple cow in a field of black and white cows. I don't hide anywhere. It's like an elephant snuck up on you in the King Super. I just don't hide because I'm built like a third string catcher on a really bad JUCO team. And so it's my reality. It's who I am. So when we talk about suicide ideation, trigger warning here, because of who I am, because of growing up in the 80s and 90s when I didn't have a lot of role models growing up. I attempted suicide in the 6th grade when I was 12 years old. I didn't see a future for me. I remember I got outed by my family at Thanksgiving in the 6th grade, and it was the worst feeling in the world because I had the loved ones laugh at me. There's nothing worse than having your family who says, I love you, laugh at you. Now I've, in rebuilding relationships and talking, I've been able to actually have an amazing relationship with my father. My mother since passed, but I've lost siblings. I'm no longer welcome. I've lost aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews. I lost my house. I lost my car. Being me has literally cost me everything. And that is, for many of us, that's the trans experience. But again, I can't imagine going through life any other way than authentic. I only get one life. I want to make sure that I live it authentically. I live it visibly. And on this Trans Day of visibility, making sure that you show up and be present. And I can't thank the allies and advocates enough that are in this talk, that are in this room, the amazing people here that do the work that they're doing. I could not do what I do without the amazing friends that I have. I have a tribe of fiercely amazing cisgender women and men. To be honest with you, I don't have a lot of trans men and trans women or genderqueer women out here in Western Kansas. We're isolated. Rural is different than, in terms of queer support. It's online, but it's not here. We just don't have that. I don't have a local support group that I can go to. I don't have a local Zoom room that I could check in every Wednesday. Behavioral health saved my life, and making sure that I have connected with amazing people, irregardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity. It's made a significant difference. Also, speaking to those parents that are in the Zoom culture, I guess, I just want to say thank you for those amazing mama bears out there and papa bears that stand up for their kids, that are genderqueer and that are trans, that'll go toe to toe with a board member, a teacher that maybe not be affirming, a principal. I absolutely think you are my hero. You're the parents I wish I had when I was younger. You're the people I wish that I had growing up in an affirming and inclusive environment so I could just be me. Again, 80s and 90s were different than they are today. And I'm blessed to see the environment that we're getting there. We are getting there. Also, I think it's important to say that for people that maybe in this presentation that aren't out yet, that maybe aren't safe enough, you're valid. I see you. And even if you can't come out and again, let's just say that whether you socially transition or medically transition, it does not take anything away from your identity. You are trans, period, end of story. Those people that socially transition and medically transition are not any more valid than those that choose to just be them. You are who you are. You were born that way. And I just want to make sure that I affirm and tell you that I think you're amazing. And sometimes being in Western Kansas or any part of Kansas, there's 1.4 million of us estimated in the United States. We're a lot. You know, if you look at population studies, whether it be 0.6% up to 2.1% or 2%, depending on what population, whether they be more of the adolescent population or teen, or if you're talking more adult population, there's a lot more of us than you would think. But part of it is, why don't you see a lot of us? Well, they keep writing legislation and bills to pass to make sure we don't grow up as trans kids to become healthy adult people. And so that has a lot to do with, I don't know anyone. Actually, you do. We just hide really well. That's why we code switch. That's why I spent enough of my life in the closet. I don't plan on ever going back in there. And so I guess to do that transformative change that we have to do as a society, we have to continue to lean on one another. We have to continue to educate. We have to continue to do lectures like this, symposiums like this. You know, I think yesterday was amazing talking about gender affirming surgeries and the things that we have to do. And thanks, Hope. I love you, sis. I think it's absolutely amazing that we have these things in Kansas of all places. Dr. Gray and her team are doing more, and we have so much work yet to do. We have so much more ground to gain. We have so many things to do, but at least we're engaging in that work. And it's a practice, not a perfect. That's what healthcare is. And so we're going to make sure that we keep leaning on our friends. And you know, I'm smiling looking at the room and some of the names I see here, and it just fills me with so much joy and support, because that's what it takes. It takes those amazing people, that amazing tribe of people that says, I got you. Let's fight legislation that's anti-trans, that's anti-LGBTQ. Let's make sure that we have inclusive policies at universities across the state. Let's make sure that we go school board to school board and make sure that they have inclusive language. If there's one thing I could ask any of you to do, and especially in those in healthcare. So here's the challenge. 10 years on a hospital board, I have had the unique experience of being patient, governance, executive, and primary care provider. I know all three roles well. Educating providers, nurses, any clinicians, easy. Educating healthcare administrators has been the most frustrating challenge of my life. For instance, when we were trying to do the HRC Health Equality Index in Goodland, Kansas, which again, we're associated with I guess a Centura Health, Catholic Health Initiative, and now it's Spirit, and Seventh-day Adventist Hospital Group with 22,000 employees. When I engaged with them trying to get this going, I was pushed back and saying, well, how's that going to play out on Main Street? Can you imagine being in a STEMI committee meeting and everyone's like, you know, I know we need to get them to the cath lab as quickly as possible, but how are they going to think about this at the local coffee shop? Like, only our population is that a thing? Like, you know, I know they give them a month of June, but I'm just not so sure about this. This is not going so well. So again, we drag our feet from a healthcare administration standpoint. We drag our feet from an HR standpoint. We drag our feet from even having a DEI committee. If there's one thing that you could do, like your Monday morning toolbox, in this case, Thursday morning toolbox, start a DEI committee immediately at your hospital or healthcare institution, immediately, because we have so much to address with implicit bias. Everyone that onboards as an employee should be taken through the process with a DEI committee. And it should not just be HR. Sometimes HR likes to own DEI, but DEI is so much more than just human resources. DEI involves clinicians. DEI involves your front office, your back office staff. DEI involves people in the community, those unusual, unheard stakeholders. making sure, and that's what I love about the DEI committee at the cabinet at KU. It's such a diverse cabinet. It's an amazing cabinet. And I want to make sure that, you know, when you get out, whether you be a nurse, an RT, I don't care. Let's play the alphabet soup. Not the alphabet mafia, that's different. But let's make sure that when you go out into those hospitals and healthcare institutions, start a DEI committee, because that's where the work is, to make sure that people are viewed, not just the sexual and gender minority communities, because what do we represent, 5%? But how about all other minority communities? Let's make sure. I also speak from a position of privilege. I know that I have less melanin in me than others. I will never understand what it's like to be a queer person of color. I will never understand and walk the mile of the shoes that's a trans person of color. And I know I'm privileged that even when I sometimes say my sob stories, it could be worse. The violence that we face on a regular day, like, you know, funny story, when it comes to just getting a job, it's been the most frustrating process of my life. I've applied at 60 positions. I've already been turned down at 33. There's nothing worse than you get on Zoom and you see their body language change and shift. You're not the trans kind of, you get the feeling that you feel like you catfished them. You feel like you showed up as your present authentic self and they loved your resume, and then you show up as your authentic self and it's like, and you know exactly how that interview is going to go. And it's the most frustrating thing to know that your unemployment rate is 3 and 4 times higher than Gen Pop, to know that your likelihood of being fired in so many other states, and there's more brilliant people than me coming up that will tell you exactly how many states that you can be fired just for being different, just for your trans identity, just for your queer identity, just for. There should never be a just for. I think that it would be nice if we could actually have a place where, you know, I was judged on the merit and my skill set and not based on the fact that I don't fit in a box. Also, another difficult topic when it comes to sex and gender minorities is sex work. Sometimes it's the only way people can put food on the table. I am not pretty enough for OnlyFans, so that's not an option. That's off the table for me. And so, but it is a reality that we face, because when you're constantly rejected for jobs, when you're constantly rejected from positions that some you're overqualified for, some you're like, well, I got this in the bag, and then you don't get it, and you don't get another one. And 30 positions later, you're thinking, what's wrong with me? Sometimes it's the only way you can put food on the table to feed your kids. And I know it's an area that we don't like to talk about, because again, we get put in that bucket of, oh, all trans and queer people are in sex work. No, we're not. It is a population. It is something to be concerned about. It is something to address in your suite, in your clinic room. And it's important because, again, that comes back to, are you asking the right questions? Are you asking sexual orientation, gender identity? When you get them back there, are you missing the opportunity to engage with them about prevention? Are you missing with them the opportunity to talk about PrEP and PEP and all the important things that we can do to slow down disease transmission, to make sure that we can keep people safe? Romantic partner violence with trans and queer community is absolutely insane. And if you do not have resources for people that are in the trans and queer community listen, you didn't deserve that. I know my inner mean girl is not very nice. And sometimes I believe the words that I tell myself, that you had it coming, if only. And so make sure that you give them resources. In Northwest Kansas, we have options, very LGBTQ inclusive. They understand intimate partner violence and how that is something we face every single day. But if your clinic, your hospital, your social workers, your team is not aware or providing the resources, because again, if 23 to 33% never walk into your office, how are you going to be able to share resources with them? How are you going to be able to keep them safe? And many of us, we don't press things. We don't move forward in things. So there's so many other things that we have to be aware of, that when we have those conversations as clinicians, we have to make sure that we are keeping our patient population safe, that we have to make sure that we're having the hard conversations. I can remember when Meaningful Use 1 and Meaningful Use 2 rolled through, we're like, I don't know if I really want to ask about smoking cessation with my patient population. Like, do I really have to provide resources? Like, is that really what I have to do? Yeah. Can you imagine? Like, this isn't smoking cessation. This is making sure that your trans queer population is safe and they're healthy and they're going to be okay. Like, should you really provide them with resources to make sure they don't die? Yeah. Should you make sure that they are safe? Should you make sure with housing insecurity, with food insecurity, with all the things the queer community faces, making sure that they have the resources they need, connect them. We go through medical school, nursing school, chiropractic school, physical therapy. You add the letters behind your name. I don't care. The important thing is that we are much more than the diagnosis codes we give. We are advocates, we are allies, and sometimes we're the only thing that stands between that patient and a really awful future. So make sure that you stand up, be present, make sure you stand up and say, I see you, I love you, I've got you. Make sure that you stand up for those trans patients in your suite and your clinical suite. Make sure that you connect them with resources. And again, whether it be the Equality Kansas Education and Research Foundation that I'm a part of, or Equality Kansas, another place that I'm a part of, or LGBTQ Wichita Health Coalition, again, another one that I'm a part of, reach out to the connections that you have. We will get you resources. We will get you people. I had an amazing clinician in Stockton, Kansas. You'll have to Google it. It's like one of those I've never been. I lived in Kansas almost my entire life, except for 3.5 years in Iowa to go to chiropractic school. That reached out and said, hey, can you teach me? Absolutely. When do you want me there? Sunday. I spent 10 hours with her and her husband, Dr. Allers, there in Stockton, Kansas. Beth and Michael, absolutely amazing, teaching them what it's like to have an inclusive practice, what it's like to, here's the Endocrine Society guidelines, here's WPATH, here's UCSF guidelines, here is what you need to do for the Pediatric Endocrine Society guidelines. Here's some amazing resources because I do a lot of lecturing for UC Health and CU Anschutz, and connecting them with some incredibly brilliant people over there as well, because I'm only 17 miles away from the state line. We're essentially Colorado. I think they'd like to annex us in. And so making sure that you do the work. We have clinics in Western Kansas now that are prescribing gender affirming hormone therapy. There are no longer telemed options that's your only option. You don't have to drive for me, it's a 5-hour drive to Wichita. It's like a half-day drive to get to Kansas City for me. And it's only 3 hours from Denver. Also, 150-mile radius, I've got 2 Starbucks. So that tells you how isolated I am out here and how very deprived we are. And so making sure that we're doing those. Amazing PAs and nurse practitioners that are doing the work. If I look at my amazing friends down in Wichita, looking at Amanda Mogwai, looking at Kayla Del Rio, looking at all those amazing clinicians that are doing the work and that have hundreds of trans and non-binary patient populations that they're taking care of, hundreds. And I just see the inclusive work that they're doing, and it just fills me with pride. They're the clinicians I needed when I was younger. Often I grew up in the gatekeeping system. I knew what it was like to have Gandalf stand at the bridge and say, "You shall not pass." I know what it was like to request, at 14 to request mental health, behavioral health, and know we didn't have the financial resources for it, and to feel like, well, when you're 14 and you can acknowledge that I'm a female, even though the doctor says I'm male, you don't feel like there's a place for you. When you go to college and you go to the clinic and say, I'd like to get on hormones, and they look at you in this look of, we don't do that here. Not, they could have taken the time to say, I see you. We don't do that. I don't feel comfortable with that, but let me give you a name of a colleague. Let me get you a referral. But to sit there with this blank stare and say, is there anything else I can help you with? I know what gatekeeping is like. With the rise of informed consent models, it's beautiful. It's not hard. Our primary care providers, our endocrinologists, those local PAs and NPs, the DOs, the MDs, whoever will play the alphabet game later. Anyone that can prescribe you with the ability to just be who you are. are life-saving, life-changing clinicians. And I can't thank them enough for the work that they're doing. I think it's absolutely incredible for the work that we have yet to do. When we have 2 clinics in Western Kansas, essentially, that will do gender-affirming hormone therapy. And again, not everyone does, but those are places that people can be seen, people can be taken care of, people can feel like there's a hope for me. It wasn't until I started gender-affirming hormone therapy that I actually saw myself growing older. Prior to that, I did not see a future for me. I could not even envision what it would be like to be old because I knew I wouldn't make it. For the first time in my life, when I started gender affirming hormone therapy, I felt like me. I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in my life. I think having just the prospect or the hope that there's a place for me, that I can grow old and I can just be me, is the most incredible gift that you could ever give a patient, whether that be if you're doing the prescription or whether you're behavioral health. And I cannot stress enough how much behavioral health has meant for me. The licensed clinical social workers, Dr. Acosta Linz, that wrote my 3rd and final WPATH letter, those are freaking heroes that we do not give enough credit. That behavioral aspect, that behavioral provider, they save lives. And so while I do think that having a clinic with an informed consent model is crucial, I went through the model where you have to have a minimum 10 primary care visits or 10 behavioral health visits before you can even be referred. So I know what that's like to go through that process without the means to do so, and just to think about people can't afford this, and to understand, the WPATH letter. So that I'll let Dr. Gray and others kind of speak to that one here, but it's for any gender affirmation surgery or gender confirmation surgery, you have to have WPATH letters basically stating that they affirm who you are, that this is true. And I've gotten 4 now. I actually have 4 letters. But basically it's kind of like your green light, like go to the next step. It feels like Monopoly, like pass this stuff, place, keep going. And so it's quite the process. You kind of feel like I feel like a project manager, whereas like I'm building like benchmarks, like, okay, I just got my 2nd WPATH letter, I can proceed to the next one. And so it's a process, but it's there for an important thing for safety. It's to make sure that, we know, like, I've been going through this since I was 6 years old. I know what I want. I've always wanted this. Like, funny story, I was an Eagle Scout, surprise. And so we went to scout camp at Spanish Peak Scout Ranch, which is about an hour away from Trinidad, Colorado, which at the time Dr. Stanley Biber was there. That's how old I am. And so before the clinic was then purchased and they moved to Burlingame, California. But I can remember being 12 and thinking, I wonder if I could hitchhike from here. That's not a normal thought for a 12-year-old to think about hitchhiking to Trinidad, Colorado, because all I wanted was a gender confirmation surgery. I didn't understand at 12 that wasn't how it worked, but that was what my thought process was at 12. I used to go to bed at night praying that, when I would wake up, because I apparently had that faith version that, God was like a genie in a bottle, that if you just, wished hard enough, it would come true, that it would fix me. I would be right, that my brain would match my body and I would be congruent. I know there's a ton of questions and I have not had a chance to look at all these. I'm going to lean out to my friend Kimberly to help me with some of these.
I would be honored to help you, Dr. Gleason. I just want to say how much we appreciate your humor. I feel like I could I would say talk with you all day, but listen to you is more like it, because you just kept me laughing. And we really appreciate that when it is a very serious and very important issue, but you just bring so much light and levity. I want you to know that the pen analogy really resonated with the audience. I think we'll all be using that. It just makes so much sense, and it breaks down a complex situation and makes it seem pretty simple. One of the first questions we had was, the individual wanted to know, when you code switch, do you have to do it more in professional settings, or do you do it more like within the community? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, it depends on what medical community, if I'm amongst MDs and DOs, I can be myself. But when I'm with other community, like in my chiropractic community, The chiropractic community is the only community that circles the wagons and shoots in instead of out. It's a bizarre community. I am a unicorn, definitely by my trans identity, unicorn because I'm a chiropractor, but then I found out what a unicorn was on Tinder and I don't identify as a unicorn anymore. And so it's one of those things that, just understanding that the code switching is you just feel it, when you have to walk a certain way, your posture changes, your mannerisms change, the way you speak changes. It's based on safety. It's based on I think it's based on the event, but most of the medical communities I'm in, I feel incredibly safe. And again, to resonate, most of my the support system is not queer. They're cisgender. They're it's kind of cishet, which is weird because I operate in that space very well.
One of the individuals said that they are a practitioner in Salina, but how can you find inclusive providers in that area?
Actually, the LGBTQ Health Coalition of Wichita actually has a list of providers statewide, and we're starting to build that out. Also, you'll see and I'll drop that link in there here when I'm done with this. But that's a good place to look. Also, reach out to all of us. I'll get you connected with people in Salina or Hayes or Dodge or Garden. I don't know. You pick a spot, I'll find you. It's like, where's Waldo? I'll find you a queer affirming provider anywhere. And so, because we know. Dr. Gray talked about yesterday about how much information is on Reddit, how much information is within, because for a lot of years, there was no one to talk to. So we just created this culture. And this is how old I am. We had, thank you, Donna, you rock. So she's got the link down below. E-groups before Yahoo groups purchased, and then we've always been here. We just had this this behind the scenes. We felt like there was never a place for us, and now that it's more visible, it's pretty easy to find those resources. But we'll absolutely connect you.
I did, just since we're talking about resources real quickly, Dr. Gleason, if anybody in the audience has resources they'd like to post, you do that to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see it. And then you'll also notice in our booklet that we put a link into the chat, and the booklet also has resources at the back of that. So you'll want to check that out. Dr. Gleason, one of the individuals was asking about a situation when the wrong pronouns are used, right? Like we might mess up, but maybe like it's in a learning environment, like our students do rotations, right? Clinical rotations. Sure. And what if that happens in a way that the individual feels it's disrespectful? Like, can you speak to the different situations and how we might handle it, how an individual might, address, like if they felt like it was a microaggression more than just a mistake?
Absolutely, because I know we like to err and say, I just, they accidentally, and we hope that hopefully creating a culture where we have a space for grace, where we can have those difficult conversations. But if it's a provider that's in charge of their clinical student, making sure that they're intervening and educating and taking that time to call someone in, not call someone out. And I think creating a culture where we can have those conversations, where they can advocate for the patient and then make sure that they know that, no, this is the way it's supposed to be, in a respectful manner that advocates for that patient. But also after you leave that clinical suite, to have that knee-to-knee conversation with your student to make sure, like, that's not how we treat people. That's how we see people. And then that pronouns matter. How you're seen that absolutely truly matters. And so having those conversations and then also involving, and that comes down to the DEI committee, to make sure that every medical student, every MPH student, every student should be going through unconscious bias training, should be going through basically, the if you will, the spectrum, the important thing that Ryan is leading and others, to go through the training of, like, we should have a 4-part equity series on, here you go. This is in your toolbox. This is what you should know. This is our expectations in the culture we want to create here at KU Medical Center.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you for mentioning the safe zone training that Ryan gives. I'm wondering, Ryan, if Ryan can share some of those resources in the chat, because I know we have that for KU Med, but I'm not sure what some of our other partners have. So perhaps that could be shared at some point. Tori, I have to say, and I don't want to get too personal, but you mentioned your attempted suicide when you were in 6th grade. And from a personal perspective, having met you just recently and fallen in love with you, I'm just so glad that you're here today. And I'm glad that you got the resources or the community you needed at that time. So we are putting in the chat some suicide prevention and help links. So if anybody's on the call and the Zoom and needs that, please look for that. I was wondering if you could speak to when you're in an interview or you're in a situation, maybe it's not even an interview, and you enter and you can see everybody's changes, like they're surprised. Like how in your, now that you're a mature woman, how do you deal with that as opposed to when you were younger? Like, can you speak a little bit to, are you direct? Like, I know you have humor. Do you use humor?
I use a lot of humor. It's my survival skill, and I also self-deprecating humor at times, and I deflect. I'm really good at deflecting. Also, I think I identify as the dog from Up because squirrel moments happen on a daily basis for me, and so I try and use that to kind of get through. But here's the thing: at the end of the day, it says more about them than it does me. And I understand that, it's not their job to like me. It's not their job to accept me. It is what it is. Again, that says more about them. I'm just going to show up, be present, and do my doggone job. It's as simple as that. I'm going to love my patient population. I'm going to try and change this. We're trying to queer the frick out of the state. I just want y'all to know, not that it's an agenda. That's just what we're trying to do. And so just making sure that we show up in a space for grace and do the work. And again, whether I get rejected 60 times or 70 times, I'm going to keep showing up and I'm going to keep applying. I'm going to keep trying because I will not give up and I will not go back in that closet because I would not have made it. And this is who I am. This has always been who I am.
I love that. I think something that we all have in common, Dr. Gleason, is the desire to have acceptance and self-love. And I see how much confidence and self-love you have. I'm not a trans woman, but I'd love to know how you developed your self-confidence. Like, I would love to have that deep, I just see that deep self-confidence that you have. Can you share that with us? Because I think as all of us as humans, we want to have that. We want to have that power and that authenticity.
I'd like to, I feel like I'm giving a Super Bowl, congratulatory speech here, but I'd like to thank my behavioral therapist. I have more than one. I jokingly say even my therapists have therapists. I've had 4 and they were all great. And I've seen them for multiple reasons. Etta Scotch and Scotch and Denver was the one that saved my life. And others. There's amazing ones in Colby, Kansas, and amazing ones in Goodland, Kansas. They're all over the place. And I think it came from that. Also, Brene Brown, I'm not going to lie. I found my truth and I found my strength in the words of Brene Brown, and that storyteller researcher or researcher storyteller. I'm like, oh, she's a nerd, but funny. I like that. I really identify as a nerd, but funny. And so, because everyone hangs out on PubMed till midnight. That's what you do, right? And so it's just, I think it's developed over that. And then just realizing that I can't change people and how they view me, but I can show up and be authentic. I lived a long enough time living behind a facade and a creation of what I wanted the world to see. I'm finally creating the real me and letting the world view me as I am. Like it or not, take it or leave it. I am extra. I know that. I'm quite well aware. And so, but I'm just going to be me in the state of Kansas doing the best job I can. And I think it takes time. I mean, it's taken me 5 years of therapy. It's taken me 5 years of a lot of crying. I'm not going to lie. I still cry. I still have hurt. Because it hurts when you get booted out of a place. It hurts when you get talked about, and it happens. It's going to happen. It's going to continue to happen. And I know that, but again, that's their issue, not mine.
That's really well said, Tori. You're a mom, and I have some questions directed to that. So can you tell, one of our attendees wanted to know, how can the average mom in Central Kansas support LGBTQIA friends and the offensive legislator pending in the state?
Right. Get involved. Liz Hammer and others get involved with writing your legislators, getting involved in testimony, getting involved in saying, the worst place is Facebook. The worst place is social media. I know they say never read the comments, but then you read the comments, the next thing you know, your day is wrecked because people are not very nice. Have you read this stuff? Like at best, I'm a really bad meme, at best on a good day on Facebook. And so like, I'm serious, don't read the comments, but you all can read the comments. Just stand up for us, please, because when we read the comments, we get all depressed and not feeling so good. And so people aren't nice. Those keyboard commandos that just, throw out there those horrible memes. And I've been, I have a meme about me, which I didn't know I was worthy of a meme, but it family, that's the way it goes. And so because rejection is real within a family, right? You come out as trans and we love you, but be brave, be amazing, be kind, but not that kind of brave or kind or amazing. We just need you to fit in this box because that's where you belong. It's those expectations need to be realized and you can't step out of line. So just stand up, get on social media, be the people we need. And sometimes we need people, Liz Hammer is one of those people that I call a friend, and she is one of the ultimate mama bears that will be at a protest, whether it be for Black Lives Matter or be there to horrible legislation in Topeka, and she will be there face to face protecting the trans people that don't have a voice, that don't feel like they have anyone standing up for them. Be an advocate and an ally.
Dr. Gleason, you mentioned clinicians providing resources. So I have two questions related to that. One is, do you know how we have the protocol for domestic violence, the questionnaire anytime you go in to see a clinician? Do you know if there's any type of movement or proposal to have something like that with information for the trans community, whether it's in the pediatric situation or any clinician situation?
I would have to defer to, I think, Dr. Megan Paisley, Dr. Michael Requino, and their social work. By the way, the social work school at KU, phenomenal resource, and their the information they're putting out. We're going to hear Dr. Paisley speak later, and she's a rock star. I am going to fangirl like crazy listening to her because she is a wicked smart girl and the best Boston accent I've got. And so I think I'm going to defer to those. But we need to do more with that, making sure that we're capturing. And again, a lot of times, if 23 to 33% aren't feeling welcome, what's the likelihood of them answering correctly on a form? What's if you don't have an inclusive space, they're going to lie. I lied all the way through my adolescence and childhood, lied all the way through early adulthood because I was afraid of being treated like crap. So as a clinician, if you can treat your patient and have that rapport with them, that knee-to-knee relationship where they know that you can speak with them, and then you're going to see them at Walmart because we're rural and we only have a Walmart, and you're not going to feel like, oh, they're telling my business. But that's the thing. I was outed by a healthcare person in rural America, so I know what that's like, and to not have that trust and that mistrust is there. So making sure that conversation is there, but also realizing that if I don't create the culture, if I don't create the environment, that honesty may not come. Not because they're a horrible person, but they're just trying to survive.
That's a really good point. And I'm wondering, when you say create the rapport, make sure that the environment is welcoming. Can you give specific tips on how a healthcare provider might do that, and especially for a pediatric in the pediatric healthcare situation?
I think you model behavior instead of recreating the wheel, right? Like LGBTQ health education through Fenway Health has some phenomenal training resources that are there with videos, they're really cringy, this is not how you do it, and this is how you do it. But it really emphasizes the point that I really believe, and hopefully someone will drop that link in here in just a minute. If not, I will. But they have great free resources. It's free. It's not hard. Just follow the recipe, and just make sure you're creating that. And it's a constant dialogue. It's like anti-racism. We can't have one seminar and you're like, oh, I'm fixed. No, it's a continual process. It's a continual conversation. The same thing, have those all-stars within in a hospital clinical setting that really get it, and make sure there's mentorship, make sure there's education, make sure you catch them doing something right. And from a proactive coaching standpoint, you really praise the behavior you want to see, instead of always feeling as a front desk or back office staff, I can't do anything right. Making sure that you're creating that culture. But there's some great resources that are out there. There's also some in free. That's the thing. This is free. treating your patients and making sure that you have the resources should not cost a lot of money, because everyone in healthcare wants to make money off of you. And so there's enough of these, I guess, Project Echoes around the country that was started at the University of New Mexico. And we have a Project Echo at Kansas as well, but at Colorado and other places, following their lead, following their education, following the projects that they have. And so I think that's imperative.
I think that there are times that you have a very kind, well-meaning individual who doesn't have the right vocabulary, or just because of our social bias that, you know, creates kind of institutional bias and habits, sometimes someone can do something that would be offensive. Is there anything that you can tell our audience that, like, very concrete, that has happened to you that an individual could avoid, or that we could be aware of? You know, we have a good heart, we want to be inclusive, and we want to make sure the person feels welcome, but I made this mistake. Is there something that you could tell us to avoid?
You know, I know that it's to go back to the golden rule, but just treat people nicely. Just be kind. You know, it's really not that hard to realize that people have more going on in their lives and their hearts than we realize, and just be kind. It's not rocket science. Like, this is really easy work to do, and but we seem to complicate it, you know, especially in the LGBTQ queer space. Like, just be nice. Really, that simple. Just be nice. And so, and then creating that, I think, that space for grace, creating that that place where we can have conversations, where we call people in instead of out, and continually learn. And again, like I said, I'll make my cell phone available. Text me, call me, let's talk. I'm willing to do the work if someone's willing to meet me halfway, and we can do the work together. And so, you know, it's hard because, again, we're not used to this. We have our struggles.
I love that. I think kindness, and we talk about it a lot, but we don't talk about it enough, because you're right, that goes so far. So, you know, we have just 2 more minutes, and I'd like to end with this question. Today is Trans Day of Visibility, Dr. Gleason. And could you just share with us what that means to you?
That means that for me, again, 5 years ago, I didn't think I'd ever have the courage or strength to be here. And it means that people just say that not only do you exist, but, and there was that tweet that I saw on that was amazing. Can we start talking about the fact that we exist? Can we start talking about the fact that we are mothers and brothers? Can we start talking about the fact that we're coworkers and friends? Can we start talking about the fact that we're hospital board members and clinicians? Can we talk about the fact that we run for office like Stephanie? Can we start talking about the fact that we get involved in community engagement, that we are stakeholders? Can we start talking about the fact that we are here to do the work if you'll work alongside of us? So it's not, while yes, visibility is important, it's also important for us to realize that we just want to live a healthy, normal life and change the world just like the rest of y'all. And again, we are so much more than just our trans identity. We are so much more than our queer self. We are so much more than that. But it did take a Trans Day of Visibility for us to say, you know what, we should do more. And we should continue to do more. And I applaud KU Medical Center and the DEI work that's being, that was started a while ago and continues. This is where we have to do it. This is the work. And this is where we learn and unlearn together. And this is where we engage together.
Well, Dr. Gleason, you are a gifted speaker. You're a tremendous human being. I enjoy you so much. I know our audience has enjoyed you. The chat is just full of how much they love you and what a great job you've done today. To be able to just speak for an hour is tremendous. I wish I had that ability. So we love you, we appreciate you, and we're happy you're going to stay around for a little bit today with us. So
I will be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Erin Manuel. I'm in the School of Health Professions at KUMC, and I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. Lindsay Collins is the managing attorney at the KU School of Legal Partnership. And so she's going to be presenting for us for a little bit, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, just put them in you can put them in the post to the panelists or to all. And I'd like to present Lindsay Collins.
Hello, my name is Lindsay Collins, and I am the managing attorney at the KU Medical Legal Partnership. Today, we'll be discussing legal perspectives for our trans community at today's symposium. I'll discuss some of the legal challenges facing our trans community right now, some good news for our trans family in the last few months, and a call to action for all of us moving forward. Back in September of 2020, a group of Republican senators introduced a bill that would have made it a violation of federal civil rights law for schools to allow transgender females to compete in girls' sports. Under the proposed, quote, Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, end quote, schools that allow, quote, biological males, end quote, to compete in girls' athletics could lose federal funding. The good news on this federal bill is that the November 2020 elections and the January runoffs in Georgia ensured that the Senate now has 50 Dems, with Vice President Kamala Harris serving as the tiebreaker, and the House remains under Democratic control. Therefore, this federal bill didn't go anywhere. However, this federal bill is the model for dozens of states who are now taking up the same anti-trans sports ban, moving through their state legislatures. Republicans in the House in D.C. introduced a similar bill in January. The bill does not describe exactly how schools should determine what someone's sex assigned at birth is, just vaguely stating that, quote, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth, end quote. The bill, which is unlikely to come up for a vote in the Democratic-controlled House, would be a direct challenge to the Biden administration's position that anti-LGBTQ discrimination is already illegal under federal law and that transgender people have the same rights to participate in sports like anyone else. Because of the Biden administration's stand against trans discrimination, advocates and policymakers were correct when they stated that those who wish to discriminate based upon sexual orientation and gender identity would dramatically increase their attacks, specifically at the state level. Chase Strangio, Deputy Director of Transgender Justice for the American Civil Liberties Union, said, "We often see backlash after advancements in LGBTQ rights, citing the flurry of measures targeting LGBTQ people and trans people specifically, after the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Bostock v. Clayton County, Georgia, which expanded the scope of federal non-discrimination law to include sexual orientation and gender identity. With fewer opportunities to roll back LGBTQ rights at the federal level under President Joe Biden, who has signed multiple pro-LGBTQ executive orders, we are now witnessing a sharp rise in anti-trans bills at the state level across the country. One example is in South Dakota. South Dakota Republican lawmakers tried to revive a bill that would ban people from changing the sex designation on their birth certificates, even after a House committee rejected that bill that LGBTQ advocates decried as an attack on transgender people. Republicans in the House forced the bill to be brought to a vote by the full House through a rarely used state legislative procedure known as a smokeout. The good news is that this bill failed to pass in the South Dakota Senate. It died in committee. One state politician, Representative Deutsch, is personally responsible for 4 different bills in the last 6 years attacking trans rights. He pushed a bill in 2020 which would have banned puberty blockers and gender confirmation surgery for transgender children under 16. In 2016, he pushed for one of the terrible bathroom bills that would have limited the bathrooms and locker rooms that transgender students can use. And he and other lawmakers have pushed South Dakota High School Athletics Association to reconsider its policy of allowing transgender students to compete as the gender with which they identify. Activists in the state expect he will bring forward a bill banning trans girls from sports soon. Let me take a moment here and remind you that state-level elections have profound impact on the day-to-day lives of people in your state. In early February of this year, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene co-sponsored legislation that would ban U.S. embassies around the world from flying the LGBTQ pride flag during June of each year. She co-sponsored this legislation along with freshman Representative Ronnie Jackson from Texas. If passed, H.R. 85, known as the Old Glory Only Act, would require the Secretary of State to ensure, quote, that no United States diplomatic or consular post flies any flag other than the United States flag over such post, end quote. It will not advance given the Democratic majority in the House, but the public discrimination on the national stage is harmful and serves as a harbinger of what is to come down at the state level. Kansas legislation that would make it a felony for doctors to provide medical treatments that help transgender youth transition is unlikely to get a hearing. The proposal from 4 conservative GOP members of the Kansas House has drawn condemnation from LGBTQ lawmakers and advocates. It is one among many measures in more than a dozen state legislatures targeting transgender youth in sports or medical treatments for them. The great news is that when the bill was introduced, House Health Committee Chair Brenda Landwehr said the measure probably would not have a hearing because the panel has too much other work, such as proposals for modernizing the state's mental health system. Again, state-level elections have consequences. Representative Landwehr kept this bill in committee, hopefully ensuring that it will not be debated on the House floor or go up for a vote. If she's your representative, let her know you appreciate her work here. There are bills in at least 20 states targeting the transgender community in what LGBTQ advocates say is an organized assault by conservative groups. The language in the Idaho and Montana measures is strikingly similar and interchangeable with wording in proposed sports bans in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arizona, Kansas, and elsewhere. Founded in 1994, an Arizona-based group called Alliance Defending Freedom has provided legal counsel for a variety of efforts to curtail LGBTQIA rights, from defending gay marriage bans to ensuring the rights of businesses to refuse LGBTQIA customers. Perhaps most notably, the ADF defended Jack Phillips, the owner of a Colorado bakery, Masterpiece Cake Shop, in his 2018 Supreme Court case over his refusal to sell a wedding cake to a gay couple. State politicians across the country are using the same boilerplate bill language to introduce these bills. Legislators do not even have to draft the bills on their own. This isn't a new tactic. ALEC, Alliance Defending Freedom, and others, both conservative and liberal, provide draft language to state legislators in order to further their various causes and positions. It is not new, nor is it party specific. I mention it only so that we can all be aware of how these bills get drafted, how impersonal and out of touch they sometimes are, given that they are very rarely drafted by the very people we've actually elected to represent us. There is power in knowing where these bills come from. We can call our elected officials and push back, reminding them that a bill written by an activist in Arizona is woefully out of touch with folks in Kansas and Missouri. That kind of pushback can be impactful. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene posted an anti-transgender sign outside of her office in late February. Her office is directly across the hall from another lawmaker who has a transgender child. The antagonizing move by Greene came as the House was expected to pass the Equality Act, a bill that would ban discrimination against LGBTQIA Americans. Representative Taylor Greene tried to block the act via legislative maneuvering, but she failed to do so. This sort of anti-trans rhetoric at the federal level only serves to embolden those at the state level who wish to further anti-trans legislation. It's dangerous and harmful to our trans family and neighbors. This is great news. The House passed the sweeping LGBTQIA rights bill, the Equality Act. I'll come back to this in a bit in the good news section. I bring it up here under the challenges because the reaction to this House bill and President Biden's executive orders regarding the LGBTQIA community. As I mentioned earlier, most of these state bills were written by the same organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom. This organization, with others, formed a coalition called the Promise to America's Children. One of the policy elements of this coalition's legislative efforts includes asking policymakers and parents to sign pledges that align with the anti-trans and anti-LGBTQIA positions its constituent groups hold. Politicians who pledge are given legislation to present at the state level. Kansas State Senator Mike Thompson made a pledge and has introduced a bill that would criminalize doctors providing gender-affirming healthcare to teenagers. Civil rights groups say this new conservative coalition is an attempt to roll back the rights of LGBTQIA Americans, particularly the transgender community, and stall passage of comprehensive non-discrimination laws on the federal and state levels. Legislators in Kansas and Missouri have proposed bills targeting transgender children. Bills moving through the Missouri and Kansas legislatures would criminalize some healthcare services and limited access to sports for transgender youth. Advocates in the LGBTQIA community say these bills only hurt transgender children, while the lawmakers behind them claim it is a move to protect all children. Kansas House Bill 2210 and Missouri House Bill 33 would make it a crime for doctors to perform any gender reassignment services, procedures, or surgeries for transgender children under the age of 18, including any puberty blockers and hormone therapy. Missouri's bill would also include criminalizing parents who help or support their children in undergoing these medical treatments, requiring that the parents be reported to the state's Children's Division for investigation. In Mississippi, the governor has signed a bill banning trans athletes from school sports. Conservative lawmakers continue to respond to the executive order by Democratic President Joe Biden banning discrimination based on gender identity in school sports and elsewhere. Governor Reeves signed this bill into law on March 11, 2021. I've provided a few specific examples across the country in these previous slides, but just how many bills in how many states are there right now? Bills in 17 states that would prohibit healthcare for transgender youth are being debated, voted on, and are moving through the legislatures. Each state's bill is in a different place and position. For example, a bill in Iowa that would have prohibited minors from receiving health care that aligns with gender identity died in committee. In Kansas, a bill that would prohibit health care for transgender youth was introduced and referred to committee in early February, but you'll recall that Representative Landwehr stated that this would likely not make it out of her committee. Thanks to a single politician, this bill will likely not be heard on the floor, nor will it be voted on. A healthcare bill in Missouri was heard on the 10th of March, but we do not yet know whether the Missouri bill will make it to the floor for a vote. 28 states are considering bills that would exclude trans youth, specifically trans girls, from athletics. Again, these are in different phases of the legislative process per state. In Kansas, a bill excluding transgender youth from athletics was passed as amended in the Senate on March 17th. In Missouri, a bill was referred to committee on the 4th of March. We await the outcome of these bills in both Kansas and Missouri. Arkansas is one of the states that have passed, and the governor has signed, a transgender sports ban. And on March 29th, the Arkansas legislature passed a bill that bans gender-affirming care for trans youth. The bill now heads to Governor Asa Hutchinson's desk. Unless he vetoes it, Arkansas would become the first state in the country to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth. This bill, along with the Arkansas bill signed into law last week banning trans girls from K-12 sports programs, will 100% be challenged in court by the ACLU and other policy and anti-discrimination groups. My hope is that there will be an injunction that will stop these laws from even going into effect until the court determines the constitutionality of the laws. Not surprising, the sports ban and the healthcare ban both passed the Arkansas legislature, but a state hate crimes bill has stalled, facing conservative resistance. The current version of the state hate crimes bill would impose additional penalties for committing a crime against someone because of several characteristics, including gender identity or sexual orientation. Arkansas is one of only 3 states without a state hate crimes law. On his first day in office, President Biden issued a sweeping executive order making it clear that LGBTQIA and transgender people are protected against discrimination in schools, healthcare, the workplace, and other realms of American life. The executive order outlines a broad interpretation of last year's landmark Supreme Court ruling in Bostock that LGBTQIA employees are covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination, quote, because of sex, unquote. The prior administration had interpreted that decision in Bostock narrowly and only applied it to employment. Biden's order calls on agencies across the federal government to review existing regulations and policies that prohibit sex discrimination, to revise them as necessary to clarify that sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. As mentioned, it is this executive order that has been driving a lot of the anti-trans state-level bills we're seeing across the country. While the executive order itself is a high-level policy statement and does not, in and of itself, immediately change any practices for public school districts, it likely signals a significant shift in how the Biden administration will interpret and enforce the rights of transgender and other LGBTQIA students. The executive order asserts that, quote, all persons should receive equal treatment under the law without regard to their gender identity or sexual orientation, unquote, including that, quote, children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. In other state-level good news, the state of New York repealed a law known as the, quote, walking while trans ban. It's been widely criticized for exposing Black and Latinx women to police harassment. The repeal strikes a statute which outlaws loitering for the purposes of prostitution from the New York Penal Code and seals the records of anyone who has been convicted of the offense, meaning that they are no longer publicly visible in most cases. This is a result of years of legal challenges and advocacy from civil rights activists, sex workers, and other criminal justice reformers. While a presidential memorandum is largely symbolic, this memo from February 4, 2021 sets the stage for this administration's international stance on LGBTQIA rights and protections around the globe. It's a very positive step forward, strengthening the federal response to LGBTQI discrimination at home and abroad. In a memorandum, HUD, or Housing and Urban Development, declared that it will begin enforcing the FHA to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, a new move that will extend civil rights protections to millions of LGBTQIA Americans. Passed in 1968, the Fair Housing Act traditionally protected against discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, familial status, or national origin. Sexual orientation and gender identity were not explicitly included. HUD's justification for this new interpretation is the 2020 Supreme Court ruling in Bostock. The Supreme Court found in that 6-3 decision that discriminating on the basis of an individual's gender identity or sexual orientation would necessarily require someone to be treating employees differently due to their sex. This is fantastic news for our trans family, who experience exponentially higher rates of eviction and homelessness due to discrimination by landlords, fellow tenants, housing codes, and housing policies. On February 25, 2021, the House passed the Equality Act, a landmark LGBTQIA rights bill that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in numerous arenas, including employment, housing, education, public accommodations, credit, and jury service. The Act amends the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and identity. The 224 to 206 vote was largely along party lines, with just 3 Republicans throwing their support behind the bill. A similar measure was introduced that same week in the Senate, where it faces an uphill battle as a 60-vote threshold is required to bypass a filibuster. The House's act, should it become law, would have profound impacts beyond the more obvious anti-discrimination protections. This headline is a bit misleading. It's not just gay men who can be rejected for being who they are. It's all of our LGBTQIA family, including trans folk. This specific provision in the bill would change how LGBTQIA people interact with the American legal system. It would bar attorneys from rejecting prospective jurors simply because they identify as LGBTQIA. Though there are some classifications that cannot be used as criteria for preemptive exclusion during jury selection, including race and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity are not among them currently. This bill would change that. President Biden has promised to build upon Obama-era policies at the State Department by allowing every transgender, intersex, or non-binary person the option to change their passport gender to X rather than M or F. It hasn't happened yet, though. Other countries have made progress in moving beyond the male-female gender binary on passports. At least 8 countries, including Canada, have legalized third gender identifiers and allowed their citizens to amend the gender on their passport without validation from anyone but the person who wants the change. In the last decade or so, Canada, Argentina, Australia, Denmark, Iceland, Nepal, and New Zealand have implemented X and O for others, markers for anyone who opt for them. This could be a real game changer for trans people in states with archaic or expensive legal processes dictating gender marker changes. For example, in Kansas, a name change requires a court order. In Missouri, a gender marker change requires a court order. If trans people live in a state other than the one where they were born, it gets even more complicated, as many states require court orders to complete name changes and gender marker changes. This leads to required travel, hiring lawyers in non-residential states, and then the complications faced if a judge were to deny the order. This kind of federal guidance at the State Department would allow anyone, anywhere in the United States to obtain a federal government-issued passport that provides gender marker accuracy and protection, regardless of what state-by-state laws regarding gender markers and name change IDs are. On March 24, 2021, the U.S. Senate confirmed Dr. Rachel Levine as Assistant Secretary of Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. She's the first out transgender federal official to be confirmed by the Chamber. Levine is a pediatrician who previously served as Pennsylvania's Secretary of Health and as a physician general, the state's top health official and top doctor. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, quote, "As transgender Americans suffer higher rates of abuse, homelessness, and depression than almost every other group, it's important to have national figures like Dr. Levine, who by virtue of being in the public spotlight will help break down barriers of ignorance and fear." And now a call to action. I want to briefly touch on the profound impact the Supreme Court will have on the LGBTQIA community in the coming years. Even as we celebrate the good news and support that some of these new bills and executive orders provide our trans family, we must remember that the Supreme Court is the arbiter of whether these laws will stand. With a Supreme Court that is trending ever more conservative, our queer and trans family is in danger. There are a number of cases working through the federal appeals courts across the country right now aimed at enshrining discrimination against trans and LGBTQIA people. With justices that are ignoring long-set precedents, this is a scary time for our trans family and our queer family. Your vote matters. How you voted in the past, how you will vote in the future, both directly impact which justices are nominated and confirmed to both the Supreme Court and the appellate courts across the country. Additionally, who you vote for at the federal level impacts whether the current iteration of the Supreme Court stays as is or changes with new justices added. Wherever you come down on these questions, that's up to you, but remember, your vote will impact the makeup of the court and thus the rulings and the decisions the court will hand down regarding trans and queer rights and protections. If you don't know, find out the names and numbers of your state representatives and senators and your governor's office, and use the numbers. Write them letters or emails, send faxes, make phone calls. If you're an introvert like me and the thought of calling and talking to somebody live about something that you feel passionate about leaves you too nervous, then call after hours and leave a voicemail message. Just let them know that you are watching them. If you don't support these anti-trans bills, then call them and tell them that. Additionally, if you don't live in a state that is passing these bills, like Arkansas, for example, but you travel there, you vacation there, maybe you fish or you duck hunt down in Arkansas. Call the Arkansas governor, call Governor Hutchinson and tell him that. Tell him that you used to travel there. You used to spend your tourism dollars there. But because he's chosen to enshrine this terrible discrimination into law, you'll no longer be going to Arkansas to spend your dollars. Let your money speak if your vote can't. If you are able to vote, I encourage you to do so. If you can write an email, pick up the phone, or visit your state legislator's office, I encourage you to do so. Direct communication regarding your support and alliance with the trans community will do more to protect them than you might think.
Well, thank you to Lindsay. Lindsay Collins was not able to be with us in person today. Unfortunately, she had a personal emergency. But we really appreciate her words and her call to action and advocacy. I think that it's inspiring, and we really appreciate her message this morning. At this time, we are a few minutes ahead of time. We'll start our next presentation at 9:30. So we have just a few minutes break between now and then. If you have any questions for Lindsay, you can put that in the chat and we will make sure that she gets the question and that an answer is provided to you when we send out the post-symposium materials. So after the symposium, what we will do is we'll copy the chat, we'll have the recording, we'll send you the booklet, the link to the booklet, and all of this will go out to you through an email. And we hope to have that to you in about a week's time. So be patient with us, but all of that will follow. For today, just so you know, we have put in the chat some links to information. So if you follow those links, one will give you information you might need for your CE credits. So please look for that. Alexa Smith is putting that in the chat regularly, and I know a lot of you will need that information to make sure you get your CE credit. We also see that you're on the symposium, so we have a record of your attendance today. So don't worry about that. In addition, we have a link for the pillars of success for a successful symposium. If you follow that link, it just has some helpful tips about putting questions in the Q&A or in the chat and engaging together. Keep in mind, we have our experts on this symposium all day long. Most of them are staying, some are coming and going, but they are happy to engage with you through the chat throughout the day. So please feel free to put your comment in there, your story, your question, whatever you want to share with everyone in that chat. You could also choose to send your comment to just the panelists or to everyone who is attending the symposium. So if you look at the chat, you have the option to put all attendees if you want it to go to everyone. If you want it to just go to the panelists, then you can click on that icon and just say all panelists. It's been a great symposium so far. We are so grateful that all 248 of you are in attendance this morning. I have to tell you that we've had this symposium now, this is our 5th annual symposium. The first year, we had an average of 30 to 50 people in each session. Last year, we went to Zoom. We had to postpone our symposium until September because of COVID-19, and we had over 100 people, about 130 people in attendance for the symposium. This year, we had to go to a webinar style because we had over 300 people register for our symposium today, almost 400 individuals. So we're very grateful for the interest and the support in this very important topic. And with that, I am going to pass the microphone over to Gigi Sears, and she's going to introduce our next presenters. Thank you. Gigi, you're not, you need to unmute yourself, sorry.
Thank you. Happy Trans Day of Visibility, everyone. My name is Gigi Sears, and I'm the Assistant Director of Professional Engagement at the University of Kansas Health System. And it is my honor to introduce Mauro Greenspan, who is the Executive Director of GATE, an international NGO working on issues related to gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. Mauro coordinates GATE's international initiative on depathologization. Mauro is joined by Keenan Russell, who is the Senior Policy Officer at Liga Europe, with responsibility for policy and advocacy work relating to trans, intersex, health, education, and the anti-gender movement. They started LGBTI activism in the US in 1996 and have previously worked with the Indiana Transgender Rights Advocacy Alliance in the USA, the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, and Transgender Europe. Keenan is also the director of Trans Survivor Network, an international NGO focused on research, advocacy, and awareness raising for the needs and care of trans and gender diverse people exposed to sexual violence, sexual assault, and rape. They serve on the chapter working group for WPATH Standards of Care version 8 and are a member of the GATE Trans Men and HIV Working Group. They also have a PhD in chemistry from Purdue University and served on the teaching faculty of the Georgia Institute of Technology from 2008 to 2013. Please join me in a warm virtual welcome for our speakers today.
Hi everyone, I'm sorry, I'm trying to start my video. So I don't know if the host can allow me to do it. Okay. Hi everyone.
Hi everybody.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us here. We are not going to use a PowerPoint, so you will need to deal with our faces speaking. And first of all, I have to say that English is not my first language, so I apologize in advance for any mistakes and say that I really appreciate your patience with my pronunciation and grammar. So with Keenan, we decided to start by describing a bit who we are, and so you have a better understanding from where we come, when preparing this presentation. Keenan, do you want to start with yourself?
Sure, I can do that. So to echo Mauro, thanks very much for having us today. We felt like part of our sort of individual perspectives was important to bring to the story we're going to tell you over the next 50 minutes. So for myself, as you may have gathered, I'm from the US. I actually grew up in Olathe. I know the KU, I know the University of Kansas Medical Center, and that's part of the reason why I'm here today, because I have this local connection. My family all still lives in the area. My sister and brother-in-law are in Olathe. My dad lives in the Kansas City area on the Missouri side, and my mom lives in Overland Park. So, I'm well connected to KU. Further than that, I grew up in Olathe, and I, as my CV said, started doing LGBTI activism in 1996, but that was before realizing my own identity as trans. I first came out as a lesbian in the mid 90s. And then I went to the University of Iowa in Iowa City and immediately came out as trans. That was in 2001. And so started my social and medical transition in a small town in Iowa after growing up in what is now a metropolis, but where we lived in Olathe, the K-10 wasn't even built yet when we moved there. So, it was kind of the middle of nowhere. Then I moved to Indiana to go to graduate school, so another sort of small town in the Midwest. I spent a few years living in Atlanta, and then in 2013, I moved to Thailand. And while I was living in Thailand, I started working with the Asia Pacific Transgender Network. That is a regional organization working on trans rights in Asia and the Pacific, as the name implies. And my role there was to work on human rights advocacy and policy work, which involved a lot of research, a lot of argument development, and working with policymakers, and also working in a context that wasn't mine. And since then, I've continued to work in contexts that weren't my own. I moved to Europe to work first for Transgender Europe in Berlin in 2018. And then I moved from there the next year to Brussels to work for Lgbtqia Europe, where I work now. Lgbtqia is a regional LGBTI organization. And I work primarily on human rights advocacy at the regional level, so with the Council of Europe and the European Union. While I was working at the previous two jobs, I also worked at the UN, which is where Mauro and I really started working together, was in that space. I think that it's important to point out that part of where I come from is as someone with a global North passport, a US passport. I speak English as my native language, and so I'm able to engage in international human rights spaces frequently in my native language. I am a migrant, live outside of my country, live in a place where I have to rely on a job for residency, and have been doing that for the better part of a decade. Yeah, maybe I will stop there. I think that that's kind of a good intro to where I'm coming from. Mauro?
Well, I am Argentinian and live in Buenos Aires, but I am the executive director of an international gender diversity and intersex organization called GATE. GATE was founded by the end of 2009, and originally the name meant Global Action for Trans Equality. Now we are, we work with more communities than just the trans community. I'm a trans person, but I'm also an intersex person, and I have been involved in both trans and intersex activism since the mid 90s. I have to I didn't start this very early, like I'm almost 50 now. And I'm in a curious position because I live in Buenos Aires, but until the pandemic, I used to travel to different countries at least once a month. And when I said once a month, like for the last 15 years, I've been traveling to different places for once, twice a month, including the US and included Kansas. So I am related
Why were
to
you going to Kansas, Mauro?
my partner is from Kansas. Their family lives in Kansas, which is, now part of my family. So not only because I work with Keenan, we met as colleagues and we work together in different projects. But as soon as I got invited to this conference, my first thought was, well, Keenan needs to be involved because this is happening in their city, and it's a place that I have got to enjoy and love. So thank you very much for inviting us. And being Argentinian and working internationally also had allowed me to learn to compare different healthcare systems, different legal systems, and learn to understand the different concerns that our diverse communities have. And when, I don't know if that's been your experience, but in mine, when I was younger, I was sure about everything. So I knew what I wanted, and I perfectly knew how things needed to be done. And then with time and, getting to meet people and institutions from around the world, that gave me the understanding that there are challenges that some people are facing in their own countries, and that those peoples are experts in their own situations. and that, you know, for people in other countries, those challenges are non-existent. And I'm mentioning this because in this conversation, Keenan and I are going to make reference to different to frameworks that maybe are going to sound strange for some of you in the US. Even that word, depathologization, which is basically to affirm that being trans is not a pathology. Many times it's difficult for native English speakers. It's really easy for us who speak Latin-based languages. But even the human rights framework, when compared with the civil rights framework, can look a bit different. But the important thing, as I was, you know, listening to the previous speaker, is that we share a common understanding about you know, respecting the human rights of trans people and being ready to defend them. So if you have questions or comments or anything that we are saying is not clear, please feel free to ask questions, you know, after the presentation or in the chat, or to contact us afterwards. We are going to share some materials and will be open, you know, for following the conversation. Pronouns in Spanish. No, for me, my pronouns are sorry, and he and him is fine. So, Kim, do you want to start from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the places we wanted to just kind of start is give a bit of a broad view on some of the human rights challenges that trans people face. And then we're going to dive a bit more into the specific topics of some of the issues and frameworks that trans people are dealing with when talking about human rights in general. The first thing we wanted to talk about, and I know that people have already discussed this to a degree today, so we'll be a bit superficial on some of these points, but they're important to kind of tell the whole story we wanted to tell. The first piece is about stigma, discrimination, and violence. I think it's pretty well understood at this point, at least within the US, that trans people are subject to a high degree of violence, including homicide. And that piece of information has infiltrated to a degree our sort of sociocultural narrative. But what is missing from that is a conversation about the systemic nature of that stigma, discrimination, and violence. We may well know the numbers that 28 trans people were murdered in the US last year, that 350 trans people were murdered around the world last year. We may have those pieces of information, but what we often don't have is the way that manifests in every trans person's life every day, be that in the times when they are using an ID that doesn't match their presentation, when they go to a restroom, when they attempt to open a bank account or a credit card and have their social security number searched, when we have to go to a doctor for anything at all, not just trans-related healthcare, but for really any reason whatsoever. These things, stigma, discrimination, and violence, manifest themselves, and they often also manifest in the home. And I think that part of what we're seeing in the current U.S., I hesitate to call it a debate, the current U.S. firestorm around trans kids and their access to either transition-related healthcare or to sports is in part a focus in on family violence and on domestic violence. And so we have a good deal of attention to the fact that that is happening now. And what we also need to keep in mind is that that violence permeates all trans people's individual relationships, be that exposure to domestic violence and sexual violence from intimate partners, or to discrimination and mistreatment at the level of microaggressions in the workplace, being misgendered by colleagues, for example, or being required to use a special bathroom so that other people aren't uncomfortable. So it's important to keep in mind as we talk about human rights that one of the sort of underpinning issues is this pervasive culture that is stigma, discrimination, and violence.
And you know, when people in general and many, you know, audiences that are not familiar with trans people and our challenges think of a trans person, uh, they usually think of someone who is a white middle-aged trans person that is maybe, you know, is has a job or has a degree, but in fact around the world one of the key elements that characterize trans lives is what we call structural socioeconomic exclusion. And that exclusion mean that many times, and even from the very beginning of our lives, uh, trans people don't have access to the kind of family and community support that we need, that access to education, primary education, high school education, university education, many times is not a possibility, that even for those getting an education, getting a job and making, you know, and having a decent salary, it's still impossible today, even in those countries where anti-discrimination laws and policies are in place. So sometimes we make the joke, activists make a lot of jokes just as a way of coping with reality. We said that socioeconomic exclusion, or just being poor or being vulnerable to poverty and even to extreme poverty, should be part of a definition of what a trans person is. And something that we are doing at GATE is to push for trans people to be acknowledged as a key population. Remember, the language of key populations come from to the international response to HIV, to be a key population in the international response to poverty and to extreme poverty. And it's worth noting that socioeconomic exclusion has a differential impact in those peoples that are migrants and people of color, especially in Black and brown people, and people coming from indigenous communities, trans people who are sex workers, and have a pervasive effect, you know, across different ages and during the entire lifespan. So if we see there are some numbers in the EU, in the European Union, 30% of trans people have some great difficulty making ends. And this was a survey made by the Fundamental Rights Agency from the European Union in 2019. And coming from the same survey, it says that 25% of trans people that participated have experienced homelessness in their lives. So when we think of trans people as not only subjects of human rights in general, but as subjects of the right to access to healthcare, we see that these socioeconomic injustice have a strong negative impact in our ability to get to healthcare. And just to put an example coming from my own region, what Keenan was mentioned in terms of violence, we see that in the effects on this combined in the combined consequences of a structural socioeconomic exclusion. The age expectancy for trans women in Latin America has been estimated in 35 years, and that is related to violence, but also to the consequences of socioeconomic exclusion, including the lack of access not only to gender-affirming healthcare, but to the primary healthcare.
And talking about healthcare, there's also a lot of this exclusion that happens inside the context of healthcare. I see people in the chat already making reference to the 2015 US Trans Survey, which is the largest survey of trans people in the US ever conducted. Hopefully that survey will happen again because it's been some time now. But in that survey, one of the pieces of information that came out was that a third of trans respondents had reported experiencing discrimination, violence, or stigma in healthcare settings. In the much more recent survey that Mauro just mentioned from the European Union, the Fundamental Rights Agency survey, which was almost as large, it was about 19,000 trans respondents across the European Union. They found that 34% of them had experienced discrimination in the healthcare setting within the last 12 months. So I actually think that that's a slightly higher result, and it's a 5-year difference in time. I think it's important to talk a little bit about what kinds of discrimination trans people experience in healthcare. And I am sure that you will hear bits and pieces of this throughout the rest of the day, but just to kind of give the highlights, there is, of course, discrimination in being able to access transition-specific healthcare. So hormones, surgeries, voice therapy, etc. Puberty blockers for adolescents. That discrimination can manifest as practitioners that ask invasive or inappropriate questions. It can also manifest as practitioners who are actively hostile and try to keep the person from being able to get their approval. But the discrimination also manifests in the existence of the approval process in the first place. We'll talk more about this a bit later, but there is a general understanding among the sort of scientific medical community that a third party cannot adequately assess an individual's gender identity. And so the fact that the medical system in the US requires a therapist or another physician to provide a diagnosis indicating that my gender identity is what I say it is, in itself is discriminatory. For a cisgender person to be able to access hormones that they need to make their body feel better and for them to be able to participate in their daily life, they go to an endocrinologist. The endocrinologist takes their hormone levels and then treats the hormone situation to get them to the right place. But for trans people to be able to access hormones, they must first be assessed by a psychiatrist and a psychologist, receive letters and a diagnosis indicating that they have a mental illness, and then may be able to access other medical care. So that structurally is discriminatory. And then the last thing that I want to put into this before we move to the next topic is that there is a significant power differential between physicians and healthcare providers and trans people seeking that healthcare. And so what that can result in is abuses of power by healthcare providers who are in a position to be able to insist, for example, that they must perform a variety of invasive or embarrassing physical exams on trans clients before or during treatment. Things that serve no medical purpose, but they're doing, and the trans patient can't say no or feels unable to say no because they're already essentially begging the provider to be able to access life-saving treatment and have fought to find a provider. And in many places, there are very few providers. When I transitioned in Kansas in 2001, we drove to Topeka and the endocrinologist abused me, but it was my only option at the time. And that, it's been 20 years, but that doesn't mean that system has actually formatively changed. There are more providers with more awareness, but the structural power dynamics that allowed that to happen continue to exist and continue to allow that power dynamic to be unequal and put trans people at risk.
And coming back to the intersectionality that was mentioned a moment ago, and just taking one dimension and one country, probably you know that 79% of the trans people that were murdered in the US in 2020 were people of color, which indicates that race is playing a key role in defining our opportunities, not only for having a life, but for surviving or not, or experiences of being trans persons. And something that happened in regard to standards, protocols, treatments, is that usually trans people coming from different class and race and minorities, or those who are migrants, they not only face a diminished or a diminished opportunity of access, having access to healthcare, but an equally diminished or denied opportunity to get their voices heard. And when I say that, I not only mention their testimonies about, for example, abuses in medical settings, or about complaints, or just the expression of needs. It also means that their knowledge is ignored, and in many cases, medical science, health institutions, health providers, they ignore the kind of knowledge, for example, on best experiences that marginalized communities have and can, provide for the general good. So in that sense, what we are seeing around the world is that many different protocols and standards of care are decided based on the experiences, the needs, the voices of a very reduced group of people, while those same standards and protocols are applied to the general population, ignoring specific knowledge on needs and issues faced, for example, by trans communities of color. This is a situation that has a global impact. For example, many different practices produced in the US are exported and implemented in other regions, which means that the knowledge of our own doctors and the needs of our own communities are usually ignored, because there is this idea that what is defined in some central institutions in the US should be valid and should be applied to trans people around the world without any kind of modification. So part of the work that we do as advocate is to insist in the need of having a global conversation and to address intersectional issues, including the geopolitics of trans healthcare. So this is just a starting point for what we are seeing as key human rights issues affecting trans people. But as you can imagine, we won't have the opportunity of discussing all of them in depth. So that's why when preparing for this conversation, we decided to address two very pressing issues. One is legal gender recognition, which, as you know, is a human right, and at the same time, and even when it's what we call the ground zero of trans people's human rights, it's just to be a person before the law, to be recognized as the person that we are, still not a reality in many countries of the world, and is put at stake by different oppositional forces in different countries, including the US. And we are going to discuss access to healthcare, including transition-related healthcare. So I would like to start very briefly, so we can make sure that we can get to cover everything, with coming back to something that Keenan mentioned when they refer to getting a letter to medical authority, because one of the experience that, I will start from a different point of view. At some point in my life, I wasn't a trans person. I don't know what I was, but I wasn't a trans person. By that time, the word cis was not around. So I can say, I used to be a cis person. And one day I found myself being a trans person. And I wasn't prepared to be a trans person. And it's not that I wasn't prepared, for identity issues, bodily issues, sexuality issues. There were many things, but I wasn't prepared, and I'm still not prepared to be treated as a trans person. And it doesn't mean that the violence and the stigma, the discrimination, because that is really horrible, or can be very horrible, but it's what I wasn't prepared for is to accept that my body, my identity, my life has worth less when compared to a cis person. That for most people, except for other trans people at the time, it was perfectly clear that being cis is better than being trans, and that those people that are not trans have the right to decide on trans lives, that we need permission to do this and we need permission to do that. And permission is permission to be who we are. So we needed a diagnosis, and we needed permission to take hormones, and we need, psychomedical and legal authority. And it wasn't only the need of the authority, was that most people believed that that was the way of doing it. Because, of course, if you are not trans, you have the right to decide. Because of what? Well, because for many people, including institutions, being trans was perceived as being a pathology. And we know that in the US, because of the DSM, trans people that are still considered to have being trans is connected to have a mental health diagnosis. And just for saying at the very beginning, there's nothing wrong with having a mental health problem. But the issue is, that distinction, according to what one person is considered to be healthy if it's a cis person, and immediately considered to have a disorder if it's a trans person. So in the US, it's still a mental health condition. It was like that at the International Classification of Diseases produced by the World Health Organization that decided in between 2018 and 2019 that being trans is not a disorder anymore. And something that we are going to see in a moment is that because of the way in which our societies and our institutions, including our governments and ministries of health, use these medical classifications, it's still very complicated to affirm that the equality between cis lives and trans lives, because psychomedical conceptions, classifications about trans lives are having an impact in our access to legal gender recognition, and are having a huge impact in our access to transitional healthcare. So I will stop here, and just for you to know, like, the DSM is considered to be like the Bible on mental disorders, but also is this like one of the foundational rocks on trans healthcare. But in most countries of the world, the classificatory system that is used is the International Classification of Diseases. So actually, there is this maybe cognitive discrepancy between classifications. And right now, actually, if I go to Europe, for example, where Keenan lives, Belgium use ICD. So I wouldn't be a person with a mental disorder there. I'm not a person with a mental disorder in Argentina, but I will consider to be someone with a mental health condition in the US. It means that right now there is a single definition or classification. What we are seeing is that more progressive legislation, as Kino will explain in a moment, are using models that are depathologizing trans people, and more conservative forces are supporting what we call repathologization, which is to increase psychomedical and legal authority over people defined as having some sort of physical or mental disorder. Keenan, all yours.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about legal gender recognition. And first off, I feel like I should just explain what that phrase is. Legal gender recognition is the process of getting one's documents changed to accurately reflect their name, sex marker, and photo. And that is not actually a single step in almost any context. In most contexts, it is many, many steps. Even in the most simple of legislative systems, like the Argentinian or Maltese systems, where a person can have those components of their identity documents changed by self-declaration with an administrative process, that's only one phase in the process. So, for example, if I change my ID, my Argentinian ID, I must then also change my diploma, change the name and information on my bills and with my bank account. I'm not actually sure if that's automatic, Mauro, but I know in Malta it's not. So there is a multi-step process that all falls under this umbrella of legal gender recognition. There are clear human rights standards in terms of what type of legal gender recognition is in line with the international human rights framework. And that includes essentially 5 things. It must be based entirely on self-determination of the applicant, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. It must be an administrative process, so not judicial, not require the intervention of a judge. It should not have any abusive requirements, such as sterilization, divorce, a diagnosis. It should acknowledge that there are additional potential gender markers necessary than just male or female, and it should be accessible to minors by some mechanism. Coming back to self-determination briefly, self-determination is the phrasing used in the human rights context to say, I, as the trans individual, am the person who can assert what my gender is and what my documents thus should say. And no one else should have any ability to object to that with very, very, very limited potential exceptions to that. For example, if I am being accused of fraud and thus need to be, need to make sure that I'm not evading taxes or something like that, right? But the decision about whether or not I should be able to change my gender marker is entirely mine. There are, I'm going to break the legal gender recognition frameworks around the world into 3 groups. The group where all of the human rights standards are met, the group where some of them are met, but there are some abusive requirements or some restrictions to access, and then the context where there is no access whatsoever. This no access context is the majority of the world, unfortunately, in land mass, and not necessarily in population. I think that the restricted access is greater in population, but in land mass, the majority of the world is no or very little access. And what that means is that people will always have mismatched documents, will always walk around their entire lives with no remedy to that situation. The circumstance where there are some barriers is a really broad group of contexts. In some places, the barriers are you need to be divorced because we don't have same-sex marriage, and so you must be single so that we're sure that you don't have same-sex marriage. And that's a simple requirement. In other places, you must be sterilized, have a psychiatric diagnosis, be on hormones for a certain period of time, and be divorced, and not have any children under the age of 18. So that there are many requirements in other places. What is, I think, the most important thing to understand is that from the human rights framework's point of view, all of those circumstances violate fundamental human rights. Any violation is a violation. Some of them are more egregious, but all of them are violations. And in the vast majority of the US, including in Kansas, there are such violations. Now, you may or may not know that the way to change your birth certificate, which is the document you must change in the US, it's based on the state you were born in, not the state you live in. And so the state that you were born in is the one that's responsible forever. You can't ever go somewhere else and change your birth certificate. You always have to go back to where you were born. And so when there are states that have really repressive legal gender recognition laws, the people who are born there are impacted by that forever. They can't ever get out of that system. And that's part of why the fight is as strong as it is to deal with the states that have no or very limited access, because someone who was born there doesn't have another choice and will always have to deal with that state's system. I already kind of listed the types of requirements that exist in some places, but just to say that many of these requirements have been questioned legally frequently in courts. And those court challenges make it to higher regional level in human rights courts as well. Some courts are being a bit more progressive than others, but all of them are moving towards abolishing or opposing restrictive requirements with a very broad scope. The European Court of Human Rights back in the 90s and early 2000s indicated that a sterilization requirement was a violation and that you could not be required to be sterilized. Conversations about diagnosis or divorce are a bit further back, though there are some national courts in Europe that have said that those requirements aren't legal either because they violate fundamental human rights. But we definitely see a trend from the courts towards abolishing restrictive requirements. And we also see a trend in Europe, at least, from places that have required sterilization in the past, paying reparations to people who were forcibly sterilized or coerced to be sterilized to be able to access legal gender recognition. So there's a clear movement away from requirements like that. The places that have a fully human rights-based framework are really small. It's only about 1% of the global population that has access to a human rights-based process. But in addition to that, there are about 1.7 billion people in the world who live in jurisdictions that allow for a non-binary gender marker. So that marker exists. Maybe it doesn't exist entirely based on human rights standards, but the conversation is shifting really rapidly, and it's shifting towards human rights standards. Yeah, I think I will stop there and we'll move to the healthcare bit. Mauro?
As I said when I started talking, when I was young or younger, I believed I knew everything. And as many other, activists, we were sure that moving to depathologize trans, for example, by engaging in the process of reform of the international classification of diseases or wearing our DPath now buttons, that was going to be enough to change the world. And basically that what the world needed were better gender identity laws, that changing medical classifications and changing the law was going to be enough to build a better world for trans people around the globe. But there was a problem there that we learned very fast, and we learned it thanks to trans advocates from the US that were very eager to explain something that some of us haven't taken into account. And it is that psychomedical categories like transsexualism, like gender dysphoria, are not only used for legal purposes, for example, to require a diagnosis to support a process of changing gender markers in someone's birth certificate and ID, but that these diagnoses and categories are used to allow people to have access to healthcare. So, for example, they are used to allow someone to get permission from their physician to start hormonal treatment and or surgical procedures. But more importantly, they are, or I don't know if this is more importantly, but it's something that at the very beginning, and I'm talking again like 15 years ago, that we haven't seen by that time is that these diagnoses were used for coverage purposes. So, which means that when we think in terms of depathologizing trans people, we need to think in terms of reforms that need to be legal reforms, but reforms also are the way in which healthcare systems work in particular private health care systems that need to be able to allow people to change gender markers and without requirements that are incompatible with human rights standards, to get access to gender affirming healthcare, and to provide coverage for treatments and procedures. Right now, there are only 2 countries in the world that have systems that allow people to get access not only to legal gender recognition, but to transitional healthcare, including hormones and surgery, only based off the informed consent of the concerned person, uh, and providing full coverage. One of them is my country, which means that when I'm having a hormonal treatment and when I had surgery, I only had to sign an informed consent. And before, because of the gender identity law in Argentina, it means that my surgery was covered, and it's covered, for example, by your own insurance, even private insurance, or because of the insurance that you have related to your job, or because the state is providing coverage under a public health system. And one of the key goals of trans activists working on these issues around the world is to get trans-related healthcare included in a process called, or a process going towards universal healthcare coverage. At something that needs to be provided on people based on human rights standards and without requiring people having to prove they suffer from certain kind of condition in order to get access to the treatment and needs, treatment and procedures that they need in order to be able to be themselves. So getting there, as maybe you can imagine, is not easy. And we have had to learn that trans people are grounding their fights in different countries using different models. So in Argentina, for example, it's against the law to require psychomedical diagnosis to a trans person in order to allow that person to receive hormones or to have surgery. But at the same time, in other parts of the world, including the US, without a diagnosis, that person won't be able to, to have access or even to afford the same kind of procedures and treatment, which, put us in a quite challenging, in the challenging positions that it's implied by facing the world as it is and saying how we can solve the issue of depathologizing trans people without creating class differences that would only allow people that can afford gender affirming healthcare out of pocket, to have access to those procedures. Well, the way have different steps. One of them is to acknowledge that trans activists will address these issues.
Laurel?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We are running out of time, and I know there's a couple of very important questions.
Okay. So
First,
no, I'm going to so we can leave it there and come back to the question. But I would say the 2 things. First, that acknowledging that activists have to, or we need to respect the way in which in different countries and even in different states in the US, activists are struggling to get access to healthcare. Second, something that I know that sounds terrible, but we can't keep living in a world where health insurance companies dictate what trans people are and dictate the way in which that if we are going to have access to healthcare or not. Third, that universal healthcare coverage is a possibility, and we need to struggle together to get our health needs included from a fully compatible human rights perspective. So let's see the question.
yeah, thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. The first question, I'm going to ask Keenan to define intersectionality for us. I just so in case there's some folks that are not familiar with the term, and then I'm going to invite Dr. Gray in to ask a question about the WPATH requirements versus informed consent. So Keenan, question for you.
Absolutely. The short version of what intersectionality is that this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist academic from the U.S. And what it says is that people who experience multiple forms of discrimination, and from the frame of reference of race and, so race and gender, race and sexual orientation, race and disability, or and race and gender identity and disability, race and gender identity and migrant status, experience those forms of discrimination in different ways than people who experience each of them independently, and that these multiple forms of discrimination interact with one another to create a unique kind of discrimination on multiple grounds at once, rather than a summative, simple, this individual is being discriminated on the grounds of race and disability. They're also being discriminated on the grounds of race and disability together. So it's a way to look at power dynamics and to see that people who are subjugated for multiple reasons are not at the same, do not experience either of those types of subjugation the same way as people who are only marginalized for that one reason, that it's a sort of cumulative and more than additive effect.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gray, would you like to come in and ask your question? And then I want to thank our presenters for such a great presentation, and we'll have a short break and reconvene at 10:30. Dr. Gray?
Oh, great. Thank you. I have a question for our expert presenters. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know one of our goals of a lot of people here today is to become better clinicians. And, you know, I kind of want to achieve that goal as well. And I would love your opinion and kind of a discussion on the WPATH standards of care versus informed consent model for initiating hormones. Here at KU, I'll admit somewhat shyly, you know, after this discussion, that we still follow the WPATH standards of care guidelines. And some of the reasons for that have been, one, just strictly historical. Our program started in about 2014, and at the time that was, you know, more the standard. Two, we have tried to get a good group of mental health professionals to minimize the barrier aspect. And I do think that, like you were saying, Mauro, like you weren't prepared for being a trans person, not in the transition, but in something that really spoke to me. You said your body or yourself, you felt like it wasn't as worth as much. And having someone kind of walk you through those challenges, a mental health professional that you already know to be there, I always found like potentially beneficial. And then third thing, just if we have a lot of different providers that come in and help in our clinic, and some feel more comfortable with the standards of care structure. So that's kind of the historic reasons for KU. But I think after listening to you, it really raises the question, like, should we be moving to the informed consent model? And I would love your expert opinion on that.
Many years ago, I went to see my doctor, and I went to a clinic where he was working. And because by that time I didn't have my ID with my name on it, like the name that I use now, there was, you know, it was really problematic to get like to the clinic, because there was a guard in the entrance, and then, you know, the secretary was. So when I got to see the doctor, I was very stressed, and my doctor said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. Are you talking with like a therapist, and like for support?" And I said, "What do you mean? I mean, I'm here in your office, and this is the clinic where you work, and I'm telling you what I had to leave to get to see you, and you're not picking up the phone and saying, 'Hey, why you mistreated my patient?' You're sending me to see a therapist to deal with this. What are you doing to dismantle that?" So on one hand, I agree with you that having access to mental health support is key. There is a huge difference between having access, for that to be accessible, and for mental health, getting a healthcare, mental health care to be mandatory. So sometimes there is a difference there. And then when we think like, well, trans people are people facing all kind of struggles due to structural cis-sexism and transphobia, having access to mental health, something that many times we don't have because of accessibility issues and affordability issues, is key. But if people need to have a diagnosis or need to have a mandatory, process going through a mental health interrogation or questioning, then it becomes more problematic. So the key question about the kind of models is what kind of autonomy and self-determination does your service acknowledge to trans people? If trans people can, if you respect them as human beings that have the full capacity to make informed decisions about their own lives and bodies, then mental health should be like offered as a service, not as a mandatory service. But if trans people are considered to be people that are suffering from some sort of condition that is impairing our capacity to make informed consent by our own, and we need the supervision or the mandatory support coming from mental health or bioethics or primary care physician, then we are in a different circumstance. Personally, I believe that a model based on informed consent is the one that is needed, is the one that is fully compatible with human rights standards.
Thank you so much, Mauro. I know we can talk about this for so long, and we're going to have to move on. I know there's so many questions in the chat and so much love for you all having a tie to Kansas. Way for us to make it about us today. But thank you. And I think you reminded us so much about human rights and that an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks very much for having us.
Thanks.
We will reconvene at 10:30 with our next speakers.